Hey there, and welcome back. This is video 2 of the word study series that I'm working through with you. So this page that I've got showing now is hopefully a review for you from the first video showing the 7 basic steps I would work through in doing a word study or a phrase study in the Bible. So feel free to pause the video if you need to look over those and refresh yourself on the steps, and we will be working through those in our study in the next few minutes. And as I mentioned in that video, we're going to be looking at the translation treasured possession from Exodus 19:5. And so here is the passage here before us with an outline summarizing it. And so before you dive into the word, hopefully you're going to be looking at a specific passage, and it's always good, if you recall, to translate or interpret the word's meaning within its immediate context. And so here it is, and specifically verses 4 through 6 give the word of the Lord to the people of Israel through Moses as they are preparing to enter into the covenant at Mount Sinai. And so just reading through it, they've come to the mountain, they're preparing. And so starting in verse 4, it says, "You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." So you see there the words in yellow are kind of typical in the sense of a covenant structure in the ancient times. If you look at the outline to the right, verse 4 gives a very brief history of the Lord's deliverance of Israel from Egypt. And then there are the present terms of the covenant, which require faithful obedience, and then future blessings or curses based upon the people's obedience and willingness to obey and keep the covenant. So when we get to verse 5 there, and we look at treasured possession, we want to dig in a little bit more into the imagery behind that idea. And so we would want to go into the original language. We would want to look it up in Hebrew and see exactly what that means. And hopefully then that'll help us fill out the picture of what's going on here. So the way I would do that, again, I would recommend using software of the type stepbible.org. Different people use different websites or programs. My favorite program that's a paid software would be Accordance, but Step Bible is very handy and useful, and since it's free, I would definitely recommend starting there. And so just working through the steps again, here is the home page for Step Bible. And if you notice, it's going to, by default, be the ESV Bible. If you wanted to change translations, you would select that here. You would click on the ESV, and it's going to pull up the range of English translations. Since we're in the Old Testament, I know that getting a Hebrew Bible pulled up as well will give me more information from Step Bible about the words that I'm looking up, because it has the dictionary, of course, with it. And so since I've got the ESV and the Hebrew Old Testament pulled up, now I want to go to our passage. Go to Exodus 19, and then we scroll down to verse 5. Just make the screen a little bit larger of the text. right, and then of course any word that is in English that has a Hebrew equivalent, when you highlight the English, the Hebrew word will highlight as well, so you know where that word is. So you don't need to be able to read Hebrew to be able to pull up the information about it. And so we go over here to treasure possession, and the first thing you would notice is that it's only one word in the original language instead of two, and we can see it there below. Treasure possession, the word is segula, and if you look down at the blue box at the bottom of the screen where the quick dictionary pulls up, it says possession, and then it gives you a range of meaning. It tells you it occurs 8 times in the Bible, and that would be the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. And the reason I pull up the Hebrew as well is when I move the mouse, knowing which word is in Hebrew, when I scroll over the Hebrew word, it pulls up just a little bit more information there in that blue box at the bottom. It tells us that it's a noun, common, singular, feminine, absolute. So Hebrew is an inflected language, meaning it has gender and number, and so it's singular here instead of plural, and it's a feminine form, and it's in the absolute state versus the construct state, which is grammatical lingo, which may or may not matter. Okay, it is something you would want to keep in mind. So we get that grammatical information by highlighting the Hebrew and the Greek words in the original. Now you could click on either treasure possession or segula, and it's going to pull up a separate box. And in order to do our word study, obviously we could take the dictionary given to us, their range of meaning, but if you want to get a clearer picture and look up all of the passages, you would want to, every time the dictionary pulls up in Step Bible, it'll tell you how many times that word appears in the Bible. And this word appears 8 times. And you would click on the number of times that it appears, and that's going to give you all of those verses then in a new window listed consecutively. So we see the other passages are 3 times in Deuteronomy, once in 1 Chronicles, once in Psalms, Ecclesiastes, and Malachi. And so what you would do is you would read each of those passages and help try to identify how that word is being used within that context. And I would not recommend just looking at the verse, single verse by itself. So you could have your own paper Bible and pull up those references. Or if you wanted to look at more verses surrounding the verse you're looking at with the keyword, you would go to the settings, this little gear box here, and if you scroll down, right now it says 0 verses on either side, and you can just add more verses, and so you can get a little bit more context surrounding the verse with your keyword. And usually that'll give you enough at least to tell you if the word is being used with the same idea or if there's a different nuance. All right, so you can see that now just looking at the Exodus passage. Instead of just Exodus 19:5, you've got verses 3 through 7, since we've told Step Bible to look at 2 verses on either side. All right, and it'll do the same thing in Deuteronomy. And of course, for all 8 appearances, it's going to give you that. So for time's sake, what I had done is I took all of those references and just put them onto a single page in my slideshow. So we'll go back to my slides and look at all those references together. All right, so what I would be doing then when I'm looking up the word and all of its appearances is just make some observations. And one thing I note is I've got all of the books of Moses here in blue, and we notice that Deuteronomy 7:6 and 14:2 both of those verses are identical. So it's a direct repetition. So the idea is obviously going to be the same. And just like in Exodus, the possessor is the Lord, and his segullah are the children of Israel who have entered into covenant with him. And we do see that they've become holy to the Lord. And so Deuteronomy, like Exodus, Deuteronomy is the second giving of the law. So it should be no surprise that this promise is being offered again, should the Israelites keep the covenant. All right, and then in Psalm 135, again we get the same basic idea. The Lord has chosen Jacob for himself, Israel as his own possession, or segullah. So instead of treasure possession, the ESV rendered it just possession in that passage. All right, but again, it's the Lord who's the possessor and Israel as the possessed. Now in 1 Chronicles 29, the subject there is David. This is King David speaking, and he is discussing the materials that he has dedicated out of his own private property to be used in the construction of the temple to the Lord. And so he's laying them aside so that one day his son can build the temple. And so he says here that I have a treasure of my own of gold and silver, and because of my devotion to the house of my God, I give it to the house of my God. All right, and then in Ecclesiastes, this is most likely Solomon speaking as the preacher here. So he's talking about his pursuit of the meaning of life, and he's talking about how he gathered for himself silver and gold and the segullah of kings and provinces. He says, I got singers, both men and women, and many concubines, the delight of the sons of man. So the segullah here would be, since it came from kings and provinces, Solomon had become somewhat of an emperor himself. They had conquered or subdued other kingdoms, and so they were sending tribute to Solomon. And part of that tribute could in fact be those singers, as well as the concubines. And of course we know Solomon took many foreign wives, and that led him astray, but that would most likely be some of what he was considering to be his segullah, besides the silver and gold. And then lastly we have this reference in Malachi, speaking of the children of Israel here, the righteous. They shall be mine, says the Lord of hosts, in the day when I make up my segullah, and I will spare them as a man spares his son who serves him. Right, so there's the promise for the righteous who serve the Lord. So again, related to the Exodus, the idea of keeping faithful to the covenant. All right, so what you would do after you've made your observations, hopefully you would be taking notes, identifying the subject, the verb in these cases, just some general observations, like it's often the Lord who's the possessor. Kings are possessors. People can be possessions, as well as silver and gold, things of that nature. All right. So once you've made those observations and taken some notes, then you would do something like what I have on the next slide, and you would develop a range of meaning just from your observations from the biblical text. So we saw that it was a feminine noun in each of its occurrences, and I've made 6 basic categories. The first one being that segullah could be a specially selected people to be possessed out of a larger group of peoples. It spoke of the relational status of faithful Israel to the Lord through the covenant. Segullah could be valuable things like silver and gold that royal figures like kings or even God acquire for their personal possession. People are things which are holy and dedicated for royal or sacred duties, including covenant partners and the priests. Okay, it could also be that which is spared from destruction because of its righteousness and faithful service to its possessor. And the last thing I noted was Segula is the most exalted and honored of all people, like the exalted honor bestowed upon an obedient son by his father. And again, that could come from the Malachi passage as well as the Deuteronomy passages, their surrounding context. Okay, so we saw all that just from the biblical usage. And once you've done that, you would then want to compare it to what the experts have to say in the Bible dictionaries and the theological dictionaries. So obviously we have already seen one range of meaning and a basic definition from the dictionary and Step Bible. But we also want to pull up some other ones if we have access to them, and I'll list here on the next couple slides some of the more popular theological dictionaries. Another thing you can do in Step Bible is pull up ancient translations, and either in Step Bible, like the Douay-Rheims English translation of the Vulgate, you can get some English translations of the ancient versions in other languages like the Greek, Latin, Syriac. And so you can look those up as well and see how Segula was translated by the earliest translators. And so we see here from the Greek Septuagint, the LXX, Laos Periousios is something like a special people. Laos means people, and Periousios is something like special. Okay, the Latin Vulgate translates it as a peculium, which comes across into English as a peculiar possession. The Syriac, which is a later Aramaic, says beloved ones, and then a Targum is a kind of like a paraphrase. So more beloved. So they would be more beloved than all the other nations. Okay, looking at the dictionaries, one of the things that the theological dictionaries will do is they will not only look at the biblical sources, but they'll look at the extra biblical writings and records which use that word or synonyms to that word, not only from the Hebrew but also from the languages that would be in the same language family. And so we see here from the Akkadian, there's a verb sakiltu, which kind of sounds like segula, means to acquire a private fortune. So that might be a synonym. And then they've seen in the Code of Hammurabi, written in Akkadian, that the king was the special or personal property and worshiper of the deity. And then in the Ugaritic, which is the language of the Canaanites, again, a word that would sound very, very similar to segula. You just see the consonants there, which is how the Semitic language works. The vowels were added later in the writing. In Ugaritic, the idea of a segullah fits as a vassal of the emperor. Okay, a couple more other dictionaries. If you pull up the Theological Word Book of the Old Testament, you would get something like a theological interpretation of the use of segula, and you can read that there if you'd like. All right. I took note from the Theological Dictionary of the Old Testament, some of their identification of how the segula was used outside the Old Testament. So in the Mishnaic and Talmudic Hebrew, it often refers to the reserve fund that a person has set aside. And again, they made the observation from the Ugaritic that it has to do with a vassal. And then something like the additional nuance of a personal or special bond. Okay. So according to the rabbis, God makes Israel his own among all the nations. It may be briefly described in today's terms as the personal savings account of the minors in the household instead of that of the head of households. Now, this is different than a peculium, such as a flock of sheep, like David would have taken care of, which is actually the property that's placed under the direction of the minor, like young David, who was actually taking care of Jesse's sheep. So he would have been the paterfamilias, or the head of the family. And so that's a peculium, which is a Latin term. And so I don't know that peculium is actually the best translation for the idea here, because segula is property that's specially set aside and kept in the possession of the owner itself, and not put under the care of another. Okay, so just a couple more here. Okay, there's a good reference from Davies in his book, A Royal Priesthood, where comparing Segula to the parallels of being a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, he says in regard to Segula, that clause emphasizes both its distinctive character and its royal associations. Okay, and we've seen that. And all of its usages, it's either gods or kings, royal figures that have segula. So with taking note of what the experts had to say, as well as our own observations, we can come up with a final kind of a summary statement of what we understand segula to be. And so my final definition would be: segula is a uniquely prized possession which is set apart from all other possessions to be placed under the direct care, protection, and supervision of a king, emperor, or god for private or personal use. The word segula is a merchant term or a market term with legal ramifications, indicating the high value and private ownership status of the possessor. Segula can either be special persons or materials who serve a unique function for their possessor from out of all of his or her possessions of the same type. And I really think that maybe the best example besides people would be something like gold that a king had acquired. And he could take much of that gold and melt it into money. And a large portion of that money or gold would be distributed and used to manage his kingdom. But then he would also set aside a portion of that gold to be his segula. And that gold would remain in his treasury to be just his personal wealth. And so that would be his segula. Once you've got the picture now, I think by looking at all of those references, when we read treasured possession or merely possession, as we do in Exodus 19:5 and the other passages, hopefully we've got a much clearer picture of what the Lord is telling Israel that they will become should they keep his covenant faithfully. And so we would want to take this and apply it to its literary context. In other words, what does the word mean in that passage, as well as in the book of Exodus? And of course, we would want to make note that it answers the question, or kind of begs the question, well, how did the Lord possess Israel? And we would say that the Lord redeemed or purchased Israel at the cost of Egypt, more specifically Egypt's firstborn son, from Pharaoh right on down to the lowest slave. And so the Lord had told Moses to tell Pharaoh that Israel was his firstborn son. And so the Lord redeemed Israel to be his own segullah at the cost of Egypt's firstborn son. Okay, and then you would think about the historical context. Where does this sit in the greater biblical story and biblical narrative? And again, this is the point in which Israel agrees to keep the covenant with the Lord, and they do become his segullah so long as they are obedient. There were conditions. All right, and once they agreed to do that, then the Lord would appear on the top of Mount Sinai and proclaim a fuller declaration of what the covenant would be and the stipulations for the people to keep and what the Lord would do in return. Okay, so it was the point at which the nation officially came into the Lord's possession. Okay, thinking about it theologically now, we can see that the Lord graciously chose to redeem Israel from the house of slavery in Egypt at the cost of Pharaoh and the Egyptians' firstborn sons. The Lord was not possessing them simply to become special servants in his household. He was instituting a covenantal relationship between himself and them as their God, Father, and King. Thus, if they would obey his words and keep his covenant, then the Lord would possess them as his own dear children, honor them as his own firstborn son, and make them royal priests in his house. Usually that was only kings' privileges in the ancient times, unless they delegated it to the common people. But the Lord was offering this to the entire nation. So in modern terms, because sonship is involved, as well as the special duties, it's almost more like an adoption. Because adoption requires a monetary transaction in almost every situation. Okay. Exodus primarily uses sonship more so than marriage to describe the image of the covenant that was formed. All right. So we've basically evaluated our word, defined it within its testament in the Hebrew language in this case, but then you always want to kind of stop if you have the time and ask, well, is this word used in the other testament, the New Testament in this case? Of course, the New Testament is written in Greek and not in Hebrew, so the question then becomes, well, how do I look up segula, which is a Hebrew word, in the New Testament? Or vice versa, how would you look up a New Testament word in the Old Testament? And the nice thing is that the Greek Septuagint is kind of the key that takes you across the two languages, because the Greek Septuagint was translated sometime between 300 and 250 BC. It was commissioned by King Ptolemy to a group of Hebrew scribes, and so the Hebrew scriptures were already translated into Greek by the time of Christ. And so much of the New Testament quotations of the Old Testament, they quote more along the lines of the Greek Septuagint than even the Hebrew scriptures at about half the time. So it's always worth looking up the Greek Septuagint if you can. And of course, if you can't read Greek and don't want to go through all of that process, which is possible in Step Bible, you can simply use your cross-references tool. And any study Bible is going to have the cross-references. Or you could do that as well, just using your English translations, still using Step Bible. So what I'll do now is go into Step Bible, and we'll go to our Exodus 19:5 passage. Now this is a very important step. You want to clear all of any translation that you're using besides the ESV. You want to clear them out, and you clear them off just by clicking on those translations. And then, because we've got that search of segula, we actually need to clear that out as well. And when you do that in the ESV, it will give you cross-references, and they appear as superscripts on the words. So let me increase the font size. So you can read it. Okay, so we go to verse 5, and we go to our word in question. Now, there's no footnote directly next to it, so I would go to the nearest one, which is the H, in front of my treasured possession. And in doing so, we see the Deuteronomy references, the Psalm 135, and the Malachi reference. And then, oh, there it is. One New Testament reference, Titus 2:14. And since they're in blue, those are hyperlinks, so we can click on it. Okay, and that pulls it up in another window for us. Who gave himself for us to redeem us from all lawlessness, and to purify for himself a people for his own possession, who are zealous for good works. And so we can be pretty confident that the word possession there is the periousios, and in fact it is. Okay, so then what you would want to do is you would want to go look at Titus 2:14 in context and ask yourself if Paul has Exodus 19 in view when he's writing this portion of his letter to Titus. And again, what I've done in my slides is I've just put the two passages side by side, and we'll compare them. But before we do that, just to get a better idea of translations again, I've pulled Titus 2:14 up, and in 5 or 6 different translations. I've got the interlinear with the Greek at the top, and we've seen the ESV. Again, the King James uses a peculiar people. The American Standard Version says, purify unto himself a people for his own possession. The New English translation says, a people who are truly his. And the NIV is pretty similar there, a people that are his very own. All right, so they deviate a little bit from the English Standard Version. And again, we've talked about the word peculiar coming from peculium. It doesn't mean necessarily that, peculiar in the sense of an odd duck, like you might think of today as someone as peculiar. It has to do with, again, a management of someone else's property. Okay, so it's always a good idea for words that you're studying to look at a few English translations to see how the translators render it. All right, so in looking at the two passages side by side, I'm going to compare the entire paragraph. And again, I'm asking if Paul has this passage in view. And if you remember from the beginning, verse 4 is a brief history, and it's the history of salvation or deliverance from slavery into God's family. And I do think that Paul has this in mind. He says, for the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation for all people. So we're seeing now in Christ a greater fulfillment of deliverance. Instead of just the Israelites being delivered, now salvation is for all people. And then Exodus 19:5 has the conditions. If you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession. And obviously, since this is just the kind of the preamble to the covenant, they don't get all of the terms of the covenant in Exodus 19. That comes in the following 5 chapters or so. But Paul does, I think, expound upon the idea of living as God's treasured possession and the ethics of the covenant. All right. And he said, so in verses 12 through 14, he talks about renouncing ungodliness and worldly passions and living self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in the present age. And so the idea is, well, how do we live as God's royal priesthood? It's by doing those things. Meanwhile, we're waiting for our blessed hope and the appearing of the glory of our great God and Savior, Jesus Christ. In Exodus 19, the people are waiting for the glory of the Lord to appear at the top of Mount Sinai. That's what they began to do as soon as they agreed to enter into the covenant. Well, Christians today are looking for the glorious appearing of our Savior, Jesus Christ. And then verse 14, he says, Christ gave himself for us to redeem us from all lawlessness and to purify for himself a people for his own possession who are zealous for good works. And so he sets up the segula or periousios by pointing out that Christ redeemed us, or he purchased us from lawlessness, and to purify for himself his own people for his own possession. All right, so we see here again that the beauty, the amazing grace of the gospel is that God has purchased us by offering his own son. So whereas Israel was redeemed at the cost of Egypt's firstborn son, all who put their faith in Jesus have been purchased by God at the cost of his very own son. So we just get a beautiful picture of the gospel and God's amazing work of salvation. And I do believe that Paul is using the Exodus 19 passage in some way as he's laying out this part of his letter to Titus, which is just beautiful. We see the fulfillment of how the new covenant supersedes the old covenant in its magnitude and really its grace as well. Okay, so that's how I would round out my word study. Just as a note, just looking at the specific word, 1 Peter 2 obviously and very clearly alludes, if not quotes, Exodus 19, 5 and 6. But Peter, for whatever reason, does not use periousios for segula in 1 Peter chapter 2. I believe it's verse 9. He uses a different Greek word, which is fine. If you're doing that comparison, you would obviously want to go and look at 1 Peter 2 as well if you're just studying Exodus 19 in general. So I hope this helps. Give you a good understanding of how doing a full-scale word study or a phrase study can really give you a much clearer mental picture of the words that you're reading. And of course you want to read slowly and you want to meditate on what you're saying and let yourself have enough time for the Spirit to speak truth through his word. Thanks for watching.